This is some significant dates. Today until Shkia had been the 19th of Kislev. 19th of Kislev, a very, very important day, particularly for Chabad, but it's called Rosh Hashanah L'Chasidus, even though it's really only a Chabad event. And this is when the Alter Rebbe got out of Isaris prison. And the reason why they make such a big deal, because the truth of the matter is every Chabad Rebbe has been in prison. In fact, even Reb Menachem Mendel, even the last one. In fact, Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik used to tell the story. They were students together at the University of Berlin. And one Purim, the Rebbe, who was just a student then, got a little shikker, and he was giving drushos in public. And the German system is so regimented that, you needed a license, whatever it is. So he was actually arrested for disorderly conduct, and he was in jail for one night, and the Rav Soloveitchik bailed him out. So he told the young Menachem Mendel, now I know you can be Rebbe, because every Chabad Rebbe has to be in jail at least one day. The story is recorded, the story is recorded down. So Rav Soloveitchik used to say, I prophesied that he would become the Rebbe one day. But the reason why Yutes Kislev is so significant is this was in the early years of the Hasidic movement, and there was a tremendous opposition from many corners, such as the Vilna Gaon and the like. And Hasidim interpreted, at least in retrospect, that the Rebbe's imprisonment was really a machlokas in Shamayim, whether Hasidus deserved to be spread or whether it should go into oblivion. And when the Rebbe was released from prison, that was seen as a divine imprimatur, that the teachings of Hasidus would spread. And in fact, people say there's a marked difference in the Alter Rebbe's teachings before his release and after his release. That after his release, they became much more profound, more Kabbalistic, deeper, because he saw this as a divine permission to spread the secrets of the Torah, which, by the way, was controversial even among other Hasidic leaders. The Alter Rebbe was criticized not just by Misnagdim, he was criticized by Hasidim. The story goes that under the arrangement, he was supposed to be released into the custody of a Goldstein who was a Chabad Chazan, who was the Chesed of the Alter Rebbe. But instead there was a mix-up, and he was released into the custody of another Goldstein, who was a great Misnagit, tremendous opponent. And for around 4 hours, this Goldstein was telling the Alter Rebbe that Hasidus is stupid and it's worthless. And the Alter Rebbe had to spend 4 hours in the guy's house until the other Goldstein came to pick him up. And the Alter Rebbe said afterwards that the 4 hours with Goldstein number 2 were a lot worse than the imprisonment in the Tsar's prison. So that's Yutes Kislev, again a very significant day in the Chabad calendar. Rosh Hashanah L'Chasidus. For those of you who learn Tanya every day, this is the beginning, or today was the beginning of the Tanya again. The other thing, going mikatze al hakatze, is that Rabbi Poston announced that next Tuesday night, because of Hanukkah, we're not having our shiur, and someone pointed out that happens to be December 24th, and that triggers another discussion of a very, very interesting minhag that some people have. And that is b'dafka not to learn Torah the night of the Christian holiday, December 24. And exactly why that came is an interesting question. Some give deep Kabbalistic idea because that was supposed to be the birthday of Yashka. Therefore, there are spirits of impurity, and they get fed, they get nourished by the ruchnius that we generate, and we don't want to feed those evil powers. Now, there's a lot that's kind of wrong with that idea. Number one, the actual birthday was certainly not December 24th. In fact, under the old Russian calendar, it was a different day, and the like, and therefore it bichlal does not fit the birthday historically. Number two, the idea that somehow learning Torah could create negativity in the world is mamish contra to everything we believe. We believe that Torah creates holiness in the world, and even though there are times we don't learn Torah, like on the 9th of Av, that's not because of any Kabbalistic idea of feeding evil powers. That's simply because we're not supposed to rejoice that much on Tisha B'Av, and therefore Torah is considered to be Simcha. So as a result, among the non-Hasidic world, this custom is totally not observed, and one should generally learn. And even among Hasidim, you'll often be told, unless this is mamash your tradition, it's not something you b'dafka take on. Now, historically, there may be a much simpler reason for that minhag, and that simply was it was extremely dangerous for Jews to be outside in the street Christmas Eve, because there were pogroms and the like. So as a result, the Batei Midrash and the synagogues were often simply closed for the night with the intention that you just remain at home. Now, that wasn't saying don't learn at home, but keep in mind that because of the poverty in Eastern Europe, the average person didn't necessarily have any real svarim at home. Didn't have a shas, like today everyone has a shas. So as a result, it turned out to be many people didn't learn because they weren't supposed to go out to the shul, and they didn't have anything at home. But to make a whole Kabbalistic idea of not learning may in fact have been a mistaken extrapolation from a de facto custom that was based on security. It's reminiscent a little bit of an old Hasidic story that a certain Rabbi had a minhag during Hakafos, that whenever people reached a certain point of the shul, they would always bow down low. And they kept that minhag for generations and generations and generations. And no one understood why. And the Rebbe said, this is what my grandfather did and what his grandfather did. It turned out that the original shul, going back 200 years, had a low chandelier. So when people were going in a circle, they had to bend. So even though the new building didn't have the chandelier, the minhag was the minhag, the custom was the custom. So that's sometimes what happens. In fact, I don't want to digress too much on this. One of the most controversial customs Chabad has, and it's a very, very controversial custom, although it's a very, very specific one, and that is they do not sleep in the sukkah during Sukkos. Now, many people don't sleep, but generally speaking, the most religious elements will tend to b'dafka sleep in the sukkah. This is the halacha of the Gemara. This is the halacha of the Shulchan Aruch. And yet Chabad has a thing that they do not sleep in the sukkah. And they'll give you all sorts of explanations. It's the makam of the Shekhinah. It's Kodesh Kedoshim. How can you sleep? When you sleep, you lose higher consciousness. How can you sleep in the presence of God? And the reasons are fine, but the problem is they do contradict an explicit halacha in the Gemara. My suspicion is that the reason they didn't sleep in the sukkah was because in Russia it's 30 degrees below zero, and you're putter from sleeping in the sukkah. They then transpose it to a much more temperate climate, and they kind of make a religious thing out of it, when in fact it was not a religious thing. And the proof is that in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, in the Shulchan Aruch of the Balatanya, he simply writes, of course you have to sleep in the sukkah unless it's cold or whatever. So how it turned into a thing, we b'dafka don't sleep in the sukkah, one has to wonder whether that was just the taking on a historical fact and misapplying it to a different environment. Okay, so that's kind of peripheral, incidental things. What I want to talk about tonight, though, is Hanukkah. And I want to start off with a little history about the sources of Hanukkah. And we know that Hanukkah is something that occurred during what is known as the Hellenistic period. Chazal teach us that there are 4 exiles that the Jewish people are going to undergo until the coming of Mashiach. This is after we got to Eretz Yisrael, so we're not counting Mitzrayim, which in a sense is the precursor of all exiles. But we have the Babylonian exile, where the temple was destroyed, and then we have the Persian exile, the story of Achashverosh, and that's when the temple was rebuilt. And then the biblical period ends with Persia. The last king that is in Tanakh is Darius II. Darius II, Daryavesh Hasheni, is the king under whose rule the second Beis HaMikdash was built. And according to Chazal, this is not explicit in the biblical narrative, Darius II was in fact the son that Achashverosh had from Esther Hamalka. So interestingly enough, the Persian king who enabled the building and dedication of the second Mikdash happened to be a Jew. It's kind of like a Jewish pope. Now, did he identify as a Jew? Not at all clear. The Gemara discusses that perhaps he was not even a righteous Gentile, or etc. But halachically, he was obviously Jewish. Now, the biblical period ends there. It ends there with the reign of Darius II, and it ends, I think, the latest date is the 32nd year of his reign. So he had a long reign. Immediately after the biblical period, and this is not in Tanakh, we have the conquest of really the entire Middle East by Alexander of Macedonia, who is called Alexander the Great, and in Chazal he is termed Alexander Mukdan, Macedonia, and that inaugurates the Hellenistic period. Now, Alexander is quite an interesting figure. His father was Philip of Macedonia, but Alexander basically conquered virtually the entire inhabited known world at the time. He had a superlative education, just to show you that the money can buy you the best teacher. His private tutor was none other than Aristotle. Philip actually hired Aristotle, the most learned non-Jew in the world, to be Alexander's tutor. Alexander became a great warrior. As you know, he died as a very young man. He died at age 32, I think. And legend has it that he died of heartbreak because he said, "I have no more worlds to conquer." Most probably he died because of some plague that he contracted in Africa. And when he died without wife or children, many say in fact he was homosexual, but he certainly was not married, did not have any children, there was of course a major succession crisis. Who is going to take over this huge empire? And the empire, I'm going to be very general and simple here, the empire was divided among 4 generals who succeeded him. For purposes of Jewish history, only 2 of those generals are significant. Ptolemy, Ptolmey, Talmai, and Seleucus. And the division basically was that Talmai took Egypt and the rest of North Africa, and Seleucus took Syria, Turkey, and what's called Asia Minor. And if you could picture this in your head, you can understand that Eretz Yisrael is right in the middle between what became known as the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucus Empire. And as a result, we're going to find that the history of that period, Eretz Yisrael was a constant football, because the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucus dynasty were constantly waging war. Now, from our perspective, it almost didn't make a difference who was the winner, because whoever won was not that good for the Jews. But there was a constant state of war. Those of you that have learned the book of Daniel. Now, Daniel, we believe, is a much earlier book. Daniel was written even before the destruction, was written after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. Parts of it before, parts of it after. But there are prophecies there. And in Perek Yud Aleph, in chapter 11 of Daniel, there is a long, long narrative in great detail between describing the struggles of the king of the north and the king of the south. How they're fighting, and once in a while there's this victory, that victory. Our commentaries say very, very clear that Daniel is actually giving you a blow-by-blow description of the various decades of war between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucid dynasty out of Syria. That Seleucid is the king of the north, Ptolemy is the king of the south, and if you look in a commentary like the Abarbanel, he matches up literally every single detail in that very obscure, lengthy prophecy with the events that happened much later. Now, in the Ptolemaic Empire, the major Jewish city was none other than Alexandria. Alexandria was a huge, huge city in which the Jews were very prosperous. They were very politically well connected. They were very assimilated. Ad kedei kach that it is said that Philo, who was perhaps the most learned Jew in the Ptolemaic Empire, perhaps some have speculated did not even know how to read Hebrew. He wrote commentaries on the Torah, but his primary source may have been the Septuagint, the translation of the Torah into Greek that was made under the rule of one of the Ptolemaic emperors and the like. So be it as it may, whether it was Ptolemy or Seleucus or their various successors, Alexander himself had initiated a process that became known as Hellenization. Now, one has to understand, Hellenization was not anti-Semitic per se. I think sometimes when we tell over the story, we envision the Greeks are targeting the Jews. That really was not what Hellenization was about. Hellenization was a political decision Alexander made. Number one, he personally loved Greek culture, although he himself was not a native of Greece, he was Macedonia. And he felt he wanted to spread its philosophy, its wisdom, its literature, its science, its mathematics, its athleticism. He wanted to spread it throughout his vast culture. And most importantly, he thought it would strengthen the political stability of his empire if he could unite all of these different cultures in a more homogenized way. So the Hellenization of Alexander's empire, which was started by Alexander and then spread by Ptolemy and Seleucus, was essentially a voluntary process in which Jews and all of the cultures were exposed to this, and many gravitated. So one has to understand that Hellenism was, Litzarenu, quite successful way before Antiochus came on the scene. Jews were assimilated, some were intermarrying, many were not keeping the mitzvot and the like. You may remember from the Gemara in Sukkah that the Gemara describes the great opulence, the fantastic wealth of the great Beit Knesset, the great synagogue of Alexandria. It says it was so huge, and they couldn't even hear the Chazan when the Chazan said a bracha, and that wasn't because of talking. We have that problem sometimes in some of our shows. But it was so huge that the Shamash had to wave a flag when it was time to answer Amen, and the like. Well, one has to understand a little bit that Chazal are actually poking fun at the community. They're not describing this with admiration. They're basically saying all those people cared about was money. They were Jewishly illiterate. That's why the Mishnah discusses all sorts of crazy questions. Can you write a Sefer Torah in Greek? Now you wonder, who would think of writing a Sefer Torah in Greek? Why are we discussing it? The answer is because in some of those communities they needed a Sefer Torah written in Greek. And when Chazal are describing the great wealth of Alexandria, they're really drawing a comparison between the poverty of Eretz Yisrael, which was rich in Torah and mitzvos and righteousness, versus these wealthy, spoiled, assimilated Jews who are full of money and power and don't have anything else. So one has to understand that in many ways, the description of the fantastic wealth of Alexandrian Jews was somewhat in the nature of cynical parody, rather than kind of an admiration as to what they represented. Just to give you a difference in perspective, we all know the story that Talmai, we don't know which Talmai, because all of the successors were Talmai. Talmai wanted to translate the Torah into Greek, and the reason was he created a library, like the National Library here or the Library of Congress, in which he wanted a copy of every book in the ancient world. There were fewer books in those days, but he wanted everything. And as a result, he wanted to translate the Torah, so the Gemara tells us that he gathered 70 elders, 70 Jewish elders, put them in separate rooms, and they all came up with the exact translation. And this is known as the Targum HaShivim, or the Septuagint. The Septuagint. And in the Bavli we read that the day that the Septuagint was completed, darkness came into the world. It was a sad day. It was a tragic day. Now the Gemara doesn't say exactly why was it so tragic. But the simple idea is that, number one, the fact that you've made the Torah accessible to non-Jews, who are now free to distort it, is one problem. Number two, the fact that Jews needed a crutch because they could no longer follow the Torah in Lashon HaKodesh is also a tragedy. And number three, all translations are incomplete because they can only capture one nuance. They can't capture all the nuances. So Chazal did not like the Targum HaShivim at all. And yet Philo of Alexandria happens to record that Alexandria Jewry would make a party on a Yom Tov on the anniversary of the completion of the Targum HaShivim. So what Chazal regarded as a tragedy was actually a simcha among Alexandrian Jews. because of the difference in the nature of the community. I remember when the Art Scroll series first began, the very first Art Scroll book in English was Megillas Esther, which goes back, I think, to 1978, quite a long time ago. It was interesting. Rav Meir Zlotowitz, Zichrono Livracha, was a graphic artist. That was his partner. He did wedding invitations on ksuvos. But a close friend of his died, and he thought to memorialize the neshama of his friend, he would do a quickie commentary on Megillas Esther, a one-shot thing, then he would go back to invitations. And that was the beginning of Art Scroll, which keeps on going and going and going and going and going. So I remember that people were congratulating Art Scroll, wonderful that you're making Torah classics available in English. But somebody pointed out, remember that when the Septuagint was completed, it was a time of crying and mourning and darkness. So on one hand, we have to be very, very happy that such translations exist, and we have to be very, very sad that there's a need for such translations to exist. So there's kind of a simultaneous happiness and a bit of a disappointment that unfortunately so many of us are not really able to access the Torah in the Lashon HaKodesh. So these are different communities. So Hellenization was making very, very significant inroads in Egypt for sure, Alexandria, but even in Eretz Yisrael to a lesser degree. For example, we read about the Tzdukim, the Sadducees. And we normally assume the Sadducees were just a sect or a group that did not believe in the oral law. That's true. But one has to know that they were predominantly wealthy, aristocratic, and Hellenistic. So it all goes together. It isn't so much that they had some religious philosophy rejecting the oral law. Essentially, they were assimilated Jews who didn't want the burden of rabbinic interpretation of Scripture to limit their actions. So the Tzdukim were much more of a political movement than they were as a religious philosophy and the like. And there were times when the Hellenizers, the Tzdukim, controlled the Sanhedrin. They actually controlled central institutions and the like. So this is all before Antiochus. One has to remember, Antiochus, is a guy who came on the scene, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But this is a process of Hellenization that began all the way back from Alexander. And Eretz Yisrael is going back and forth between the king of the north and the king of the south. But the Tzad HaShaveh is, no matter who the king is, the same process is going on. So it almost made no difference to us. So now, yeah.
I understood the Sadducees controlled the temple and they put themselves positions.
Very often. It depended on the, absolutely. The whole story that there were times they controlled the Sanhedrin, and eventually they got removed, but it was a long process. So now we come to Antiochus. Basically, in the political football of constant war, at some point we have a king, Antiochus the fourth, and he was a very, very successful warrior, soldier, and he captured Eretz Yisrael, and he gave himself the title Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes means Antiochus the Great. So when you read in a history book Antiochus the Great, that is the Antiochus, the great villain, the villain of the Hanukkah story. Antiochus was despised even by many of his own subjects, non-Jewish subjects, and they changed his name a little bit. Instead of calling him Antiochus Epiphanes, which means Antiochus the Great, this was the title he gave himself, they called him behind his back Antiochus Epimanes. They took out the PH and put in an M. Antiochus Epimanes means Antiochus the Crazy, Antiochus the Insane. And Antiochus had an agenda. His agenda was also Hellenization, but it was Hellenization by coercion. He thought that the process of assimilation, which actually was working quite successfully, and that's something that's very painful to us, he thought needed to be accelerated. So as a result, he promulgated anti-religious legislation that Jews were not allowed to practice certain mitzvahs. Now one has to understand this was absolutely unique in the ancient world. We're used to lumping all the bad guys together. oh, there's Paro and there's Nebuchadnezzar. One has to understand that Antiochus was very unique. Antiochus was the first king in history who specifically passed laws targeting religious observances. Paro, in Mitzrayim, let's say, didn't care. I mean, I don't know if people wore tefillin then, since before Matan Torah, but Paro didn't care if you davened, if you learned Torah. You were a slave. You got to do your job. What you do in the privacy of your home is your own business. Even Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, was not targeting religious observances. He wanted people to bow down to him, etc., but he didn't really care if you kept kosher. That wasn't his affair. The very first king, Haman certainly didn't care, right? Haman didn't care if you were from or not from. Haman wanted to kill every Jew, religious or not, and Haman is the prototype of the enemies of Israel, like Hitler. The very first king who specifically targeted the Jewish religion was Antiochus, where upon pain of death he prohibited the observance of Shabbos, the observance of Kashrus, the sanctification of the new moon, the Jewish calendar that determined the holidays, and if someone was caught doing this, they would be chayav misa. The story then becomes familiar. Most of the Jews had already abandoned the Torah, and there were a few more that did so out of fear of persecution. But then we have the small band of people under the leadership of Matisyahu, who was towards the very end of his life, and they stood up, they hid to the caves, they withdrew, they started a guerrilla warfare against the most powerful army in the world. But it's important to emphasize again and again and again that the motivation of what is called the Maccabean revolt was not political independence, although it did achieve political independence. It was the desire to obtain the freedom to be able to observe the Torah without persecution. There is absolutely no question at all that the revolt against Antiochus was a religious revolt. This, by the way, let me point out the contrast with the revolt of the Jews against Rome that culminated in the Churban by Yesheni in the year 70. Keep in mind that our sages were against the Jewish revolt against Rome. Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai, our sages took the position that, okay, we're under Roman rule, Rome is persecuting us, but Rome at that time was letting Jews keep the Torah. The motivation for the revolt against Rome was in fact a political and economic one, and the sages took the position that let's live under these difficult conditions because at least we can keep the Torah and we have the Beis HaMikdash. And if Rome destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, that was a result of this revolt, which the Chachamim did not approve of at all. And all of the stories we hear, again, we hear in the Gemara about Rome made all these decrees that if you learn Torah, you're going to die, and the death of Rabbi Akiva. Keep in mind, that was after the Bar Kokhba revolt. That was more than 50 years later. Meaning, if you were to transpose yourself to Eretz Yisrael right before the Churban of the first temple, Rome was the second temple. Rome was a cruel ruler. I mean, there were taxes that were very heavy and many Jews were reduced to poverty. But you had religious freedom. Rome didn't make any Rome was not into the same homogenization as Greek culture. Rome said, do what you want. I don't really care if you're learning Torah. It made no difference to us. Rome was so religiously apathetic, they just didn't care about any of those things. So one has to understand that the Maccabean revolt was a totally different type of war than was the revolt against Rome. The Maccabean revolt was motivated for religious reasons. So what eventually happened was, in fact, by the way, the Maccabees, again, just to clarify this, there are two terms we use for the army. We call them Maccabeim, the Maccabees, and we call them Hashmonaim. So there is a technical difference between them. Hashmonaim, again, the origin of the word is not so clear, but many say Hashmonaim is the name of Matisyahu's family. And they were given that family name because their origin was a town in Eretz Yisrael called Hashmona. So Hashmonaim means the family that emanated from Hashmona. And that is only a designation for the family of Matisyahu, including the kings who later ruled in the Hasmonean, the Hashmonaim dynasty. Maccabim, on the other hand, was the name of their entire army. The army was the army of the Maccabim, and the etymology of Maccabee, there are two famous, it was not a Kupat Cholim, there are two standard origins of Maccabee. Some say it's an abbreviation on their banner, Mi Kamocha Ba'ilim Hashem, who is like you among the gods, Hashem, and they went into battle with the Maccabee banner. And others connected to Makevet, which is hammer, that they were able to smite the enemy like a hammer. Now, there is a difference in spelling, because if it's Mi Kamocha Ba'ilim Hashem, the second letter will be a Chof, just like the Kupat Cholim spells it that way. That's how we spell it. But if, on the other hand, it's Makevet, Makevet is a Kuf. So you might wonder, how could the Meforshim debate if Maccabee is with a Chaf or a Kuf? Let's just look in the book of Maccabees and see how the word is spelled. The answer is, we don't have a Hebrew original book of Maccabees. We only have a Greek original book of Maccabees, and in Greek you can't really tell what the Hebrew consonant would be. So as a result, the commentaries are in disagreement what the origin of Maccabees are. Now, the Hanukkah story takes place in really a relatively small window. We have Antiochus's persecutions, we have the Maccabee revolt, led by the 5 brothers, sons of Matisyahu. Matisyahu was very old, and he died at the very, very beginning of the conflict. At a certain point, the Greek armies, meaning the Syrian Greeks, gained control of the Beis HaMikdash. And when they gained control of the Beis HaMikdash, they contaminated it. They built houses of prostitution. They sacrificed pigs to Avodah Zarah. They set up idols. They didn't destroy the Mikdash, but maybe something gets even worse. They contaminated it. They desecrated it. They were Mechalel Shem Shamayim. And you know the day that they gained control of the Mikdash was the 25th of Kislev in the year 188 BCE. In other words, the day that became Hanukkah later, you'll see in a moment, was the day of the entry of the Greeks into the Beis HaMikdash and their contamination of the Beis HaMikdash. 3 years of fighting, and on the 25th of Kislev, exactly 3 years, Mayet Liet, Yehuda HaMaccabee led the army of the Jews, and they regained custody and shalita over the Mikdash, and then we have the Hanukkah. Then we have the Hanukkah story. 3 years Mayet Liet. The temple was liberated, purified, and redeemed on the very day that it had been desecrated and captured 3 years earlier. By the way, the military story of the Maccabees, if you like military history, most of us are not that interested, is very, very instructive, because if those of you that remember the United States' involvement in Vietnam will know that essentially, no matter what the U.S. says, they kind of lost in Vietnam. And it's kind of a pella. How do you have the most powerful army in the world losing to these peasants and these farmers who had no real training at all? And the answer is that in guerrilla warfare, even small groups of people who know the terrain and they can hide out in the caves can defeat huge armies which simply don't have the skill to maneuver in these small, isolated areas. And the historical precedent to that was the Maccabees defeating the Greek army. So I am told that during the Vietnam years and afterwards, the book of the Maccabees was a mandatory reading assignment in West Point to kind of train American soldiers how to understand guerrilla warfare tactics. Because the book of the Maccabees goes to the military history very, very extensively. So now, what I want to show you is this. What are the historical sources to the story of Hanukkah? So the oldest historical source we have is a book that is called Sefer HaMaccabim, and there are actually 4 of them. There's Maccabim Aleph, Maccabim Bet, Maccabim Gimel, Maccabim Dalet. But Gimel and Dalet are not historical. Gimel and Dalet are more philosophical. So really it's Maccabim Aleph, Maccabim Bet are the sources of the story of Hanukkah. They were probably written originally in Greek, because that's the earliest version we have, although some do say there may have been an earlier Hebrew original. When were they written? They were written, we don't know exactly, but they were written fairly soon after the occurrences of Hanukkah, which occurred 185 BCE, was the liberation of the temple. Let me remind you, I think I mentioned it last week, this was not the end of the war against Antiochus. The war against Antiochus and then his successors lasted another 25 years. So Hanukkah is not the end of a military conflict. Hanukkah is towards the beginning of the military conflict, but it's so significant because we liberated the Beis HaMikdash. That actually has a very, very deep spiritual significance that I'm going to get into. Now, the book of Maccabees does continue the war, so it was probably written no earlier than 30 or 40 years after the Hanukkah story, after the wars were completed. Who wrote it? We don't really know, anonymous authorship, but it is considered to be, it's not part of our Tanakh, it is not a sacred book, but it is considered to be a reliable source of history, so that even the Rishonim use it in various translations, such as Rashi, Ramban, etc. They did draw on the book of the Maccabees as a source of history. So here, what's very interesting is the following. If we ask ourselves, why was a holiday of Hanukkah instituted? So all of us are familiar with the answer because they found a jar of oil that was not contaminated, and there was only enough to burn for one day, and it burned for 8 days, and therefore Hanukkah is 8 days. That is in the Gemara, and I'll talk about where we get that from, but that is not what the book of Maccabees says. In Maccabees 1, it simply says the following: when we consecrated the temple, when we rededicated the temple, we celebrated a dedication ceremony of 8 days, just as when Moshe Rabbeinu dedicated the Mishkan, there were 7 days of consecration followed by the 8th day, which was the final day of celebration. So it's very, very clear. There's not even a mention of finding this miraculous oil. It's very clear that Hanukkah, in fact the name Hanukkah means that, Chanukah, dedication. Hanukkah was an 8-day celebration for the liberation and dedication of the Beis HaMikdash and redeeming the temple from the foreign hands to which it had fallen. And of course that's symbolic generally of the ability to serve Hashem without a foreign power trying to stop you from doing so. Okay, so, and this, by the way, answers, well, I'll go back to that in a moment. Okay, that's what Maccabees 1 said. Chanukat Habayit. And that makes sense. That's the name, Chanukat Habayit. The dedication of the temple. And the 8 days is not connected to a miracle of the oil. The 8 days is because Moshe Rabbeinu's Chanukat Habayit was 8 days. Maccabees 2, which largely goes over the same history. It's interesting, Maccabees 1, Maccabees 2 are describing the same events. But they do have an interestingly different perspective on events. This is very, very fascinating. Maccabees 1 emphasizes the military prowess of the Maccabees, their military strategies, their successes. Maccabees 2 emphasizes a different type of heroism, the heroism of martyrs who gave their life al Kiddush Hashem. So for example, the famous story of Hannah and her 7 children who died before they would worship Avodah Zarah. So it's interesting, both occurred. But Maccabees 1 emphasizes the heroism of the Chayal, and Maccabees 2 emphasizes the heroism of those who died rather than violate the Torah. This is so fascinating because there are contemporary controversies even today about what is the most suitable way of memorializing the Shoah. Everything in Israel is a controversy. There's nothing in Eretz Israel that does not turn into a machlokas. And Yom HaShoah, at least in the early years of the state for sure, was a major source of sometimes acrimonious, bitter controversy. Yom HaShoah, of course, is observed in Nisan. That itself is a halachic problem. You're not supposed to have sad days in Nisan. So the Rabbanut gets kicked in both directions. You're not supposed to have Yom HaTzmaut during Sfira, because you have to be sad, and you're not supposed to have Yom HaShoah during Nisan, right? So you have to reverse it. So we should have Yom HaShoah in Ha'ir and Yom HaTzmaut in Nisan. Maybe that would work out. I mean, it wouldn't be the right dates. But why was Yom HaShoah chosen? It's a date in Nisan, because that is the anniversary of the fall of the Warsaw Ghetto, and it commemorates the hero. In fact, its official name is Yom HaShoah v'Hagavura. You have to understand that in 1948, which was a scant 3 years after the end of the war and the Holocaust, there were many Jews who, again, I hate to even say it this way, who were a bit ashamed of the 6 million Jews who died in the slaughter. They went like sheep. They represent the Galut mentality. They represent the old-fashioned Jew that is victimized and gets pushed around. And that's not the type of Jew we want to honor. We want to honor the heroes, those who fight, those who don't allow you to push them around. So the question is, if that is your orientation, how do you honor victims of the Shoah and at the same time put up as your model that of heroic resistance? Well, the answer is you choose the one outstanding event where Jews took an active role in armed resistance against the Nazis, and that, of course, is the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, the people of the Warsaw Ghetto were absolutely heroic and are deserving of commemoration. But there were people who felt deeply hurt because they saw that by glorifying the Warsaw Ghetto to some degree to the exclusion of those who did not fight, there was a subtle message that was being communicated that the people who are passive, are not so deserving of our respect. So obviously, I mean, the point is that I just want to point out that Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2 reflects the exact same tension that we had in the Kviyut of Yom HaShoah, in which Maccabees 1 wanted to emphasize the Gevurah, and Maccabees 2 wanted to emphasize the martyrdom. Now, obviously, both are true. I mean, this is not an either-or choice, but the question is, which is the thing that you want to talk about more? But okay. But going back to the reason for Hanukkah, Maccabees 1 says the reason of Hanukkah is Chanukah Tabayit. Maccabees 2 gives a reason that, frankly, may even sound a little bizarre, and that is, since the Yevanim had possession and control of the Beis HaMikdash for 3 years, obviously the Chagim, in terms of their korbanot, were not observed for that entire period of time. So Klal Yisrael wanted to have a make-up ceremony for the last Chag that they missed. The last Chag that they missed was Sukkot. Sukkot itself is 7 days, but immediately after Sukkot is Shemini Atzeret. So they made an 8-day festival of Hanukkah as a makeup for Sukkot. Ad kidei kach that in Maccabees 2 it says people took lulav and esrog for the 8 days of Hanukkah. And again, Maccabees 2 does not mention any miracle of the oil, nor does it mention that they lit Hanukkah. The way they observed Hanukkah was they took lulav and esrog. Now, halachically, that behavior makes no sense at all, because you cannot make up Sukkot. There is a limited way. You can make up Pesach even then. You don't make up Pesach totally, but you can, if you're Tameh, you can bring the Korban Pesach a month later, it's Pesach Sheni. But Sukkot, you can't make up Sukkot by 6 weeks later, taking lulav and etrog and the like. And because of this, Chazal make no reference. In other words, this aspect of connecting Hanukkah to Sukkot is extinct, meaning Chazal simply do not refer to it. But, Lani Astati, I would like to suggest that there's one remez in rabbinic literature to this Maccabees 2, which means even though Chazal dismissed it halachically, it survived in one way. All of you have learned over the years the famous machlokes Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. What is the order in which you light the Hanukkah candles? According to Beit Hillel, which is of course what we do, is you go up in number. You start with 1, and then you go up 2, 3, 4, ascending number. According to Beit Shammai actually says, strangely enough, nobody follows Beit Shammai, but Beit Shammai actually says, you start with 8 and you go down. And one of the reasons the Gemara gives is, why does Beit Shammai say you go down? Because he compares the Hanukkah candles to the bulls, to the parim that are brought on Sukkot. On Sukkot we bring 70 bulls keneged the nations of the world, and we bring them in descending order. 13, 12. So Beit Shammai says, just like the parim of Sukkot are descending, the neirot of Hanukkah are descending. I will discuss next week what the spiritual message of that is, or not next week, but 2 weeks. And all the commentaries go crazy with, what's the connection between the bulls of Sukkot and the neiros of Hanukkah? There's no connection. And they develop thematic connections. But I would like to suggest that maybe, just maybe, this is a historical connection to Maccabees number 2, in which the origin of Hanukkah was connected as a makeup for the festival of Sukkot, and therefore the Hadlakat HaNeirot mirrored the Parei HaChag, as if to say, we couldn't bring the Parei HaChag of Sukkot when it's not Sukkot, but we lit the candles to correspond to the Parei HaChag. Be it as it may, what is so unusual here is that whether it's Maccabees 1, Chanukah Habayit, or Maccabees 2, make up for Sukkot, there is no mention at all of the Pach HaShemen, of the miracle of the oil. Right? Doesn't mention that at all. And let me point out that in the Al HaNisim prayer that we recite in benching and in Shemona Esrei, there is also no mention of the miracle of the oil. It talks about the struggle against Yavan, which was a spiritual struggle because they wanted to take away the Torah from us. And Hashem allowed the pure to be victorious over the impure, and the few over the many, and those who keep the Torah over the Rishayim, and the Tzaddikim over the Rishayim. And then we liberated the temple. But there is no mention of a miraculous burning of the oil. It says simply, Hidliku Neirot B'chatzrot Kadshecha. They lit candles in the courtyard of the temple. That's not miracle. That basically says, among other things, they did the menorah again. It doesn't say there was a miracle. So it's pointed out that at least in 3 very important sources, there is no mention of the Pach HaShemen. The Pach HaShemen is not mentioned in Maccabees 1. It is not mentioned in Maccabees 2. And it is not mentioned in the Al HaNisim prayer. It is mentioned in Masechah Shabbos, which quotes a brisa from a sefer that is called Megillas Tanis. Now, Megillas Tanis is a very early sefer. It is earlier than the Mishnah. It is a list of the days that Jews are not allowed to fast because they're festive. And it gives the Hanukkah story. And it mentions that a jar of oil was found, and it was only able to burn for a day, and miraculously it burned for 8 days, and Hanukkah is 8 days. Now Megillat Tanit was written before the Mishnah, but the Megillat Tanit was written approximately 30 of the Common Era, meaning 40 years before the destruction of the temple. So figure this out. The Hanukkah story is 185 BCE. Megillat Tanit is 30 Common Era. In other words, Megillat Tanit is more than 200 years after the Hanukkah story. So at least in terms of a written record, the first reference to the Pach HaShemen is around 200 years after the Hanukkah story, and the Pach HaShemen is not mentioned in Maccabees 1, Maccabees 2. Now, I am not going, you might be suspicious where I'm going with this, I am not going in the standard academic mahalach, which we believe is kfira. The standard academic mahalach, maybe I shouldn't say it in the show, the standard academic mahalach says, Pach HaShemen was a made-up story, didn't happen, therefore that's why there's no record of it, that's why it's not mentioned until later, because it was made up. Chas v'shalom. That's not what I believe, and that's not what I'm saying. We believe there certainly was a miracle of the Pach HaShemen. But let me share with you the thought of the Maharal. The Maharal says this on his own, by the way. The Maharal doesn't even say this in reference to the book of the Maccabees. He may not have seen the book of the Maccabees. But the Maharal on his own says it's a davar pashut to him that the holiday of Hanukkah was enacted not because of the miracle of the oil, but because of the dedication of the Beis HaMikdash and the defeat of the Yevonim, as the Al-Anisim says, and as Maccabees 1. And the Maharal's argument is the following. Because we don't make Yomim Tovim over miracles unless they pertain to the survival of the Jewish people or the liberation of the Mikdash, something that applies to our ability to serve Hashem. So to simply say, oh, a miracle happened and the candles burnt for 8 days. Okay, a miracle happened. But we don't make Yomim Tovim just because a miracle happened. We make Yomim Tovim when we're liberated from our enemies. We make Yomim Tovim when we can serve Hashem. So the Maharal on his own says, on his own, actually writes, the holiday of Hanukkah is a celebration over the ability to serve God by the liberation and purification of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, if that's the case, the Maharal says, so why was there a miracle of oil? Like, that's not part of the holiday. And yet we commemorate it by lighting Neirot. So here's what the Maharal says. That God did a supernatural miracle to remind us that our military success was not a result of our own arrogance and pride. You know, the Torah repeatedly warns us that when we will be successful against enemies that are very powerful, we will attribute our success to us. That is called kochi v'yotzem yadi. My power achieved my victory. And the Torah warns over and over and over again not to be arrogant, not to be prideful, not to attribute your successes to your abilities. It all comes from God. So the Maharal says the miracle of the Neirot was the perspective that made us realize that the nitzachon of the milchama comes from God in a supernatural way, beyond our own abilities. So you see what the Maharal is saying, and this, I think, is the thinking of the book of the Maccabees. We didn't make the Yom Tov because of the miracle of the candles. We made the Yom Tov, Hanukkah Tabayat. Again, the reference to Sukkot, that's ignored indeed. That the Maharal doesn't even pick up on. But let's look at Maccabees 1, not Maccabees 2. Maccabees 2 is an anomaly. But Maccabees 1, Hanukkah Tabayat, liberation of the Beis HaMikdash. The Al-Anisim says, Bo banecha l'dvir beisecha, right? Your children came to the temple and they purified it. But we needed the miracle of the Neiros so we understand that just as the miracle of the Neiros was a supernatural intervention of the divine, we must regard our military victory in the same way. Right? So it's a necessary part of the Hanukkah observance, but it's not the reason for the kfiyut of the Chag. Now with this actually provides a beautiful answer to the most famous question of Hanukkah. The most famous question of Hanukkah is Rav Yosef Karo's question, the Beis Yosef's question. And that is, if there was enough oil for one day, and the miracle was that it burned for 7 days, so the miracle is 7 days. Why do we celebrate Hanukkah 8 days? It ought to be a 7-day holiday starting from Chavav in Kislev. Right now, there are at least 500 answers to this question, because I have a sefer that has 500 answers to this question. Now, of course, I think the author cheated a little bit, because when you start looking at the answers, you see that some of them are very, very similar. So answer 351 is similar to 469. So, the truth of the matter is, if he, for some reason, he wanted, I'm trying to remember, why did he want 500? Ner b'gematria is 250, so he had some cheshbon, he wanted double ner. So if you're looking for a number, you start taking answers that are very similar and making them different, but there are plenty of answers. But the Maharal himself says, if you understand the structure here, you have a very different answer. The 8 days of Hanukkah are not because of the 8 days that the oil burns. The 8 days of Hanukkah are because those were the 8 days of the dedication of the Beis HaMikdash, just as Moshe Rabbeinu had 8 days for the dedication of the Beis HaMikdash. So the fact that the miracle of the oil is 7 days is not relevant, because that's not why Hanukkah is 8 days anyway. It's a brilliant answer. According to that understanding, the 8 days of Hanukkah is not mekushar to the Neirot, and the Neirot are simply giving us a perspective. So based on that idea, let me just finish up quickly, based on that idea, the significance of the Neirot is to negate the kochi v'yotzem yadi, the idea of arrogance, which brings in our egotism. I don't want to get into delicate territory, but some people have posited that, after the 6-Day War, which was a truly miraculous victory, many people did tshuva. A lot of people were inspired to see the hand of God. But there were others who basically said, this proves nobody can beat us, we're the most powerful soldiers in the world, and we're invulnerable. And then a few years later, we had the very, very sad Yom Kippur War, in which there were many casualties, and unfortunately Israel did not do very well. And obviously, I'm not a Navi, and I'm not expressing my opinion, but I'm just saying that there were people who said that Hashem was kind of sending a message that when you attribute your success to yourself, you set yourself up for great failure later. And the Yom Kippur War was a very humbling, in a very tragic way, a very humbling experience for the Jewish state. And therefore, we need the Neirot to negate the arrogance of kochi v'yotzem yadi. But I would like to add that I think there may be another message as well. And here it's extremely important to remember, as I said before, that the miracle of Hanukkah was not the end of a struggle. It was the beginning of not the beginning, but it was towards the beginning of a struggle that was nimshach for more than 25 years. Now think about this. If you're a Maccabee and you're confronting the most powerful army in the world, and you're not trained, you just have a few people, and your own Jewish people think you're fanatic and crazy. Fewer than 10% of the Jews were keeping the Torah, keeping the mitzvot, supported the Maccabees. Most looked at them as fanatics. You would be prone to feel, what's the point of going on? I'm so small, I'm so puny, I'm so ineffectual. So what is the message of the Neirot? Look at this oil. This oil can only last for 1 day. It's insignificant. But you put it in, you do what you can, and then God blesses your efforts beyond what you thought was possible. What message is that giving the Maccabees themselves? Keep on going. Don't give up. You think you're ineffectual. You think you can't accomplish anything. That oil couldn't accomplish what it did either, but it did it. In a way, it's much more powerful to get this message at the beginning of your struggle than to get it at the end. Because that's the message of hope. That's the message of not giving up. And that gave the Maccabees the encouragement to keep on going. Now, there is a sad end to the story. Ultimately, when the Maccabees did establish a Jewish state, the Hasmonean state, what eventually happened was they became the very enemy that they were trying to defeat. They became Hellenistic and the like. It's very similar to George Orwell's Animal Farm, in which the animals become oppressive, and that's the parody of the Russian Revolution, where Stalin and Lenin were certainly no more benign than the Tsar, the worst Tsar was, and the like. So there is a whole secondary story of the Chashmonaim, which we're not going to get into now, but at least initially, those lights are such a beacon of hope that a Jew doesn't give up. And that has a modern application, because we live in a world that is filled with darkness on many levels. Ignorance, hate, violence. Just, was it last week, the Jersey City, Jews got killed. Policemen got killed trying to apprehend a person. And a world of violence, hate, anti-Semitism, a world of ignorance, assimilation, intermarriage. The private darkness of depression, despair, loneliness. And it's our job to bring light into the world. But we think our light is so ineffectual, our light is so weak. And the story of Hanukkah is, you light the light that you can, and then Hashem takes over. And therefore that's the great message of hope that Hanukkah represents. The Nechot gave hope to the Maccabees to continue against odds that were unimaginable. And they continue to give hope to us to continue to try to bring light into the great, great darkness that envelops the world. So I wish you all a very happy and joyous and lichtige Hanukkah full of light and simcha, and may the Hanukkah be a harbinger of our future redemption.
Yiboneh Archives, Yitzchak,